Hi guys. Um, yeah, so in this one, I I want to talk about a very interesting concept, and it's the question of whether reality is whether our minds convey an objective reality or whether they simply convey a representation to our consciousness. And you know, to me, it seems that I can't answer that question. I believe in this sense, Cartesian doubt totally renders a determination of an answer to this question impossible. Um, but regardless, I still think it's an interesting question. Does my mind represent objective truth to me in my sensory experience, or does it simply represent a subjective representation? Now, this gets back into simulation theory and whether, you know, um, and whether the sensory experiences that we have are legitimate, are objectively true and valid, whether they convey any real information about reality. I mean, it seems to me that our brains are encased in a skull. And so our only way of perceiving the world is through our sensory apparati, right? So our eyes, our nostrils, our ear canal, we have little orifices on our head, and they're essentially little sensory orifices. And so we can take in all of the stimuli and data, and our brain can then combine all of that stimuli into a coherent picture. But, you have to remember, so Schopenhauer definitely thought that, in his work, in his seminal work, The World as Will and Representation, he certainly thought that what we perceive as reality is simply a representation of our own consciousness, and that what we see is as much a part of what we are as what it is, and that there's no escaping, there's no legitimate way to discern between what happens to be an objective fact and what happens to simply be a sensory representation. And so, clearly our sensory perceptions can map onto the physical world and convey certain things about the physical world from our own subjective perspective. But for instance, it's all subjective, and what we perceive is as much a part of what we are as what it is. And so we not only bring psychological baggage to every perception, we also bring the unique limitations and constraints of our own brain's ability to model reality. And so Schopenhauer certainly thought that now in philosophy we have this antagonism across time between philosophers on the nature of reality and whether we can perceive the nature of reality, which is the fundamental question of philosophy. If philosophy and science is about perceiving the nature of reality, the question that should start first is whether we're even capable of perceiving that reality. And we can't really start philosophy on any other sound basis. And it's all a part of the gene, the philosophy gene, maybe which is very speculative, but to question whether we can even know. And that's the fundamental question of philosophy. And I define philosophy as a process often by which knowledge devolves into outright relativity, and certainty devolves into uncertainty, and answers devolve into questions, and certainties, devolve into ambiguity, and all of this. And that's the fundamental task of philosophy, is riddling out whether we can know and what we do know. And now there's an antagonism in philosophy. Schopenhauer was very much influenced by Eastern philosophy. He was a German philosopher, to go over the history here. On the other hand, we have Ayn Rand, the philosophy of objectivism. Schopenhauer really doesn't craft his own school of philosophy. He more or less just kind of provides his own commentary on other schools rather than originating a school himself, but still a very important philosopher. But if I can even say that, but he's popular, so popular enough, and had some interesting things to say. But Ayn Rand, on the other hand, does not believe that our sensory experience is a representation. She believes that that our sensory experiences convey objective truth, and that's why her philosophy is called, she calls it objectivism. And so there's a competition in philosophy over whether or not whatever position you take on this, and this is epistemology. So for people watching, we're really getting into, now the reason I titled this video The Fibers of Being is because I do think that much of what we perceive in a sensory way is a representation, right? It's as much a reflection of us as of it, if there even is an it. I mean, Descartes thought there was just an us rather than an it, right? Which is why he says, I think, therefore I am, in his meditations. And so I guess I would take the side that much of what we do perceive is a representation. It's a good representation, probably, because we're alive and we can function and seem to understand certain things. But I don't necessarily think it's infallible. And remember, from an ant's perspective, what am I, right? I mean, from an ant's perspective, what is a ceiling fan? From an ant's perspective, what is an automobile? And from my perspective, right, so they exist almost in 2 dimensions, we in 3, what about 4? So what we perceive is as much a part of our own, as much a part of how our brain evolved as of what's really there. And so, because we've survived, and species have evolved and life has persisted, the reality they model probably is accurate, because if it weren't, they wouldn't survive. But regardless, that's only to make that's not to say that what we perceive is real, which is the real question here. And why, and more importantly, why it would be fake. And so, I take that question very seriously, because I do live my life with a lot of Cartesian doubt, but I think it's very reasonable doubt. Ayn Rand would say that it's not, and that she'd take the more evolutionary argument that if the reality that we represented were not accurate, we wouldn't have survived. So clearly it's good enough to provide a logic for it being good enough. That doesn't mean that it's perfect. I mean, there are things that we simply can't perceive, like radio waves, certain frequencies of light. I mean, so what we perceive is as much a part of a reflection of the perceiver and of the perceiving apparatus as it is of the objective reality, which probably doesn't actually exist. I mean, existence is a concept in the mind. If minds didn't exist, if our minds, and so, it's just, and I don't know, that's not but it's called The Fibers of Being, this video, because it's to harken back to nerves and nerve cells. And in those ways, nerves, if reality is just if the reality we perceive is just a representation of our nerves, then quite literally nerves are the fibers of being. And so that's why I call it the fibers of being, because I take more the side that what we perceive is a representation rather than a fact. And it's very difficult to make qualitative statements about reality when you're operating on that framework. And I just think that, these are very important issues to consider. I would challenge any utilitarian person, any fact-based kind of, well, it works, if it works, it works. I would challenge you to really consider what you can state are facts and what simply are apparent facts. So, distinguish between a fact and an apparent fact, and recognize that it may be narcissistic of us to think that we can know objective truth. Regardless, I think there are a number of arguments presented here that may or may not be interesting. And then I would definitely take the side of reality, the sensory experience that we know, at least, being more of a representation. And right, the everyday details of that sensory experience that we're all acquainted with are more or less just reflections of our own, the perceiving apparatus, rather than of the thing in of itself. and the perceiving apparatus has its own limitations and constraints. As I said, the brain is inside of a skull, and it doesn't actually have any eyes, and it's not open to the world. I mean, it can only perceive through itself. And so and of course the sensory orifices. So, this is all to say that humans, and, it's all to say that the fibers of being may as well be our nerve cells, and that, because the reality that we know, is it a reality or is it a representation? And is it a fact or is it a representation of the fact? And yeah, so if you're an empiricist, you would say, yes, this is valid via the arguments I provided about, if our representation were invalid, we wouldn't survive. But, you could, it's possible, again, I've stated this in another video, you can be both logical and unempirical. And so not everyone is an empiricist. But if you're an empiricist, you'd say that what I perceive is reality. If you were an epistemologist, you'd say, it's probably just a representation. And people forget, we often frame things in the form of dilemmas, either or. We always forget that both is an option. So yeah, it is what we perceive is a representation, and it is a reality. It is both simultaneously. So those are my thoughts on that. But this is just introductory epistemology, and I'd love to talk about it more. But for the sake of clarity, I guess the clarity that comes from being concise in my videos, I'm not going to elaborate too much more on that, and I will close the live stream now. But I would encourage anyone that is starting to study philosophy really to investigate that question, to read The World as Will as Representation by Schopenhauer. I haven't read the whole thing. I haven't read it at all, honestly. I've only read snippets of it. But I prefer at times to just know what they said and ultimately get their arguments without necessarily needing to go through all of their dictation. Because at times, philosophers will dictate and use syntax that is it's not always, sometimes their ideas are very clear and simple. It's just their expression of their ideas is very wonky and abstruse. And so, it is sometimes better to simply get at the get at the meat and then to throw away the chaff. Many of the philosophers that we know communicate through writing primarily. And so, and if they're remembered, they're communicating through writing because, it's the only way that we can really record historical memory. It's not the only way now, but for them it was. And so, in this sense, anyone we remember, you get my point. And at one time, writing was the primary way of making a record of all of that. Now, of course, there are other ways to make records, but so we know them through their writing. But don't necessarily read the work, because that can ultimately at times distract from what they're really trying to say, especially if you're reading something like Hegel, which I've attempted the phenomenology of spirit when I was in high school, but it was pretty difficult for me to comprehend back then, if not impossible. So I could only get vague inklings about what he meant, but his ideas themselves are not that complex. So that's more or less a part of the pretense of academia. But regardless, I would really encourage you to ponder these questions and to consider what your answers might be to those questions, and to take all of these concepts a little farther in your daily life, and so yeah. Honestly, I don't like doing this. I don't like keeping the stream open particularly, because I feel like it wastes time and it adds length to the video that doesn't really need to be. I want these to be watchable, right? Not just, I want people to actually watch them. So I would love to pause and maybe take questions, or if someone has a related thought, that would be wonderful. But I will pause for just a couple of seconds, and then if anyone has any major, uh, you know, points or questions, that would be nice to have something more to chew on, I guess. Sorry, guys. I may have a friend who might want to join the stream and maybe ask some questions related to the topic. I don't like pausing and giving a little intermission for stuff like this because I do want the videos to be watchable as videos rather than just as streams of consciousness. But I will wait. I will pause for a brief moment to see if I've got anyone that would want to hop on and maybe continue the conversation a little bit more deeply. All right. Well, I think I will close this one out then. Thank you for watching. Hopefully this got you thinking about some fun questions. It's at least an introductory philosophy video. It's nothing special, but it'll at least get your mind, get you down the right rabbit hole. But remember, don't go down the rabbit hole unless you can catch the rabbit. Thanks for watching.